Thank you so much for having me. This is a real honor to be here today. I want to start my presentation today by showing you guys a quick video so that you can meet for yourself some of the amazing women journalists from Global Press Institute. This video was filmed in Nepal.
Correspondent and cover stories internationally. And while I was, working my tail off and trying my best, I realized I wasn't the right person to be telling the story.
CRISTI Hegranes is a highly trained journalist studying at the prestigious Poynter Institute for Media Studies before getting her master's in journalism at New York University.
I didn't speak the language. I didn't have the trust of the local people. I was an outsider.
After spending time in Nepal trying to convince locals to open up and tell their stories, she realized that despite all of her training, in the end, she was and always would be the outsider. And that would be a difficult obstacle to overcome. Which is why she decided to go to work with insiders.
All of the indicators from World Health Organization and the United Nations tell us that when you invest in local women, they reinvest in their community. So that's really the first agent of change for us, is employing and investing in these local women.
CRISTI started recruiting women she could teach to become journalists, to work for a new organization called the Global Press Institute, GPI.
We want our stories to be different and better than every other story coming out of Nepal. So anyone who takes our training program and completes it for 6 months gets a job offer from GPI. We offer them long-term employment so that they can put the skills that they've just learned to practical use. The training curriculum at GPI focuses on really traditional, rich, ethical, investigative reporting. So it's not blogging, it's not more citizen journalism kind of style. It's really really rich, traditional, ethical storytelling. And you guys alone can show the world a different side of Nepal, both good and bad.
CRISTI looks for women who are willing to work hard, to learn, and most importantly, have a desire to better themselves. One of her prize reporters is Tara Bhattarai.
Myself, I like to write a story about women-related issues.
Tara was on advertisement for GPI back in 2007. The job offered an opportunity she and many other women in Nepal couldn't have dreamed existed.
When I was a child, at that time, for the ladies, not allowed to go to school. So I struggled to go to school, and I was also that time parentless.
After working as a reporter for 5 years, CRISTI promoted Tara to editor of the GPI news desk in Nepal.
You know that our mission is to do 3 things for women around the world: educate, employ, and empower them using journalism. So we strive for innovation in the stories that we tell. We want our stories to be different than any other media story. These women, Tara in particular, in so many ways, I consider her almost like the co-founder of GPI, because she demonstrated that it works.
On this day, Tara's assignment is to interview a woman who was a victim of domestic violence and had been kicked out of the house by her husband.
कति वर्षको उमेरमा चाहिँ गाउँ छोड्नुभयो अथवा कसरी काठमाडौँ आउनुभयो? 16 वर्षको उमेरमा चाहिँ काठमाडौँ.
The interview starts slowly. Tara does most of the talking. But as she continues her conversation, the woman gradually becomes more comfortable and is soon opening up about the hardship she has faced.
पठाउनु भएको.
After 90 minutes, Tara has enough for her article. As soon as she completes this story, she will move on the next and the next, focusing on women's issues that are overlooked in Nepal's media.
GPI is very important because Nepal is a very poor country and lots of problems here.
She walks through the streets a strong, confident woman, nothing like the girl Christy first met.
Someone like Tara, who, 6 years ago was a very different person in a very different place, and today, she walks into a room and people want to shake her hand, and she can get interviews in any government ministry, and she's powerful. She's powerful, and people read and recognize her stories, and so that's really great to watch.
But everything that's in that frame, the viewer sees, and sometimes something might be distracting.
The women who are hired as reporters for GPI receive professional training. If they can produce good reports on important issues, it can mean worldwide exposure through syndication for themselves and GPI.
When you take a photograph, the shutter of the camera opens and closes to let in light to make the photograph.
तपाईँले याद गर्नुभएको छैन हामीले जब फोटो क्लिक गर्छौँ त्यतिखेर हुन्छ नि
If I told the women during the training, they're photographs that have changed history, that have changed the course of a war or changed a civil rights or social movement.
But the focus at GPI is not just producing news content.
After they go through this training and they understand the power they have with their words and now with their photographs, as one of the girls said last night, my stories are all around the world with this sense of pride. And you're talking too about women who often didn't have much of a voice before.
And with their new voices, these young reporters are focused on giving others like them their own chance to be heard.
I have to raise the voice of people's voice. That I'm really happy with because I have a tool, I have a skill to raise the issues of the voiceless people.
You can sense the emotion in Yam Kondel's words. Her work as a reporter is important. In fact, she feels her reports on climate change and health issues in Nepal are the most important thing she has done in her entire life.
I'm really very happy to work with my team and with the GPI team. I'm really, really, very happy. I don't have any word to express my happy, really.
Each of the GPI reporters is equally impressed at the life-changing opportunity offered to them.
I never even thought that I would become a journalist one day and my voices would be global voice one day. It's amazing thing. It's amazing.
Offered to them by CRISTI HEGRANES.
We're now in 25 countries in virtually every region of the world, and we employ more than 120 women. The opportunity means so much to these women, and it's been really, truly extraordinary to watch them use this opportunity to not only change their own lives and their families' lives, but literally the lives of millions of people. In the hands of women, journalism can be a change maker for the entire community.
Grinnell College proudly recognizes.
All right. So that gives you a little sense of who some of the women of Global Press Institute are. I love starting with that video because for so many years, the story of Global Press Institute was my story. But now, having this video and having greater tools and technology all over the world, more and more these women are able to begin to tell their own stories via video. As it said at the end of the video presentation there, Global Press Institute is currently in 26 countries around the world, and I employ 133 women around the world. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Ethiopia for the launch of our 26th news desk. And just as I was 25 times before, I was so taken when I got to meet the 6 young women who had just gone through the recruitment process to become part of the GPI team for the first time. These young women are passionate and vibrant, and they're so incredibly just dedicated to this notion of using story to change their own communities. And as I looked around the room as the training was about to begin, we had such a diversity of women, and I'll talk a little bit later about how we go about recruiting such a diverse population of women. But from a brilliant Muslim college student, a young 18-year-old who asked endless questions. The energy in the room is so interesting. But then I noticed that there was one new journalist who was very quiet, solemn even. And as I began to learn a bit more about her journey that brought her to Global Press Institute, my enthusiasm and vigor for this work that I do was renewed all over again. This young woman is 20 years old. She's in the 8th grade, and she goes to evening classes in Ethiopia's capital of Addis Ababa. She was forcibly married at the age of 12 and lived with her husband for almost 5 years before running away in the far western part of Ethiopia. For the last 2 years, she's been living on the streets. She's currently still homeless. But when she heard this new call in her community, that the opportunity where someone like her could become a journalist, a real live professional journalist, she knew that she had to do it. So when I had the opportunity to first sit down and talk with her and ask her why she was there, she said it was because when she heard about it, it was like a dream come true. And that she was so dedicated to this idea of becoming a journalist because she wanted to do one very, very particular thing. She wanted to tell stories about other girls throughout Ethiopia, and she wanted to use journalism to tell stories about education in Ethiopia. Because she said that she wanted her stories about girls and education to reach parents throughout her entire country so that they could understand the importance of letting their daughters stay in school. Now, this young woman is one of the newest members of Global Press Institute. In fact, she just completed her 2nd week of training on Friday. But with this opportunity, it's so important to understand that she's not only going to become one of the preeminent journalists in her community, one of the only young women storytelling about other young women in Ethiopia. From this opportunity, she's going to also earn a living wage. She gets paid for the hours that she spends in training, and because the Global Press Institute model is a training to employment model, she'll be paid for every article that she produces, both radio work and print work as well. So this opportunity is not only going to change local and global awareness and perceptions, it's going to change her life. It's going to get her off the streets. So while she is one of the newest members of our team, she absolutely embodies the spirit of Global Press Institute. And that is a spirit that I'm here to talk to you about today, because Global Press Institute is a living testament to the power of story. Here are some of the young women who just began taking the training at the GPI Ethiopian News Desk. So you can get a sense of what they look like and who they are. The Global Press Institute Ethiopian News Desk is one of our youngest news desks. It's a desk that operates in partnership with the Nike Foundation, an organization that's dedicated to employing young women between the ages of 15 and 22. So this is one of our youngest desks. So as I said, Global Press Institute is an organization that celebrates the power of story. Over the last nearly 7 years, we've demonstrated that the sharing of human stories using principled ethical journalism can change minds, it can change countries, in fact, it can change the entire world. But before we start talking about how Global Press Institute creates all of these world-changing stories, first, there's my story. As was mentioned, I founded Global Press Institute at the age of 25, and I have long believed that I was born to be a journalist. I've been asking questions and writing and reporting since forever. After I graduated from Loyola Marymount University, I went to the Poynter Institute for Media Studies, and from there went on to get my master's degrees at New York University. Right after that, a new opportunity was presented to me, the opportunity to go international to report. I became a foreign correspondent covering the civil war in Nepal. Here's me when I was just 23 and the first time I was in Nepal as a journalist. Now, being a foreign correspondent was my dream job, absolutely. It was everything I had always wanted to do. But it didn't take long after I arrived in Nepal before I realized that I was the wrong person to be telling these stories. As a foreign correspondent, your job is to go to far-off places to tell other people's news, right? Places where you don't often speak the language, places where government often controls who you can talk to, where you can go, and the kind of stories you can tell. So you're forced to work through translators, and you lack access to real people. Those are the real people whose stories you need in order to really tell a full contextual picture of a place. But there's another problem too, is that these real people, they often don't trust us as foreign correspondents because they've seen themselves portrayed in our news, right? They're poor, hungry, disease, and disaster-ridden people. 97% of foreign correspondence that appears in American and European newspapers is on just 4 topics: war, poverty, disaster, and disease. This is what we know of the developing world. So the stories that we tell as foreign correspondents are very often these surface stories, right? The ones that are easiest to see, easiest to tell, impossible to ignore. That's why we tell stories from Haiti only after it's been destroyed. That's why we talk about places like Egypt and Libya only after they are in chaos, right? Because these are the stories that are obvious to the world, the stories that foreign correspondents are sent to tell. But those were not the kind of stories that I had waited my entire life to tell. So I continued my work as a foreign correspondent in Nepal, all believing that there had to be some way that deeper, richer stories from this fascinating country of Nepal could be told. And eventually, as I trekked throughout this country in search of these stories, eventually I got lucky. I met a woman named Pratima. Pratima was the matriarch of her community. She had everything that I wanted as a journalist. I watched as she negotiated small conflicts in her village. I watched as people came to her to share their secrets and seek advice. And I listened as she spoke deeply, knowledgeably, and intently about the problems facing her community in the midst of civil war. She had the social, historical, cultural, political context that as a foreign correspondent I craved. I listened as she spoke about the need for more education. I listened as she discussed with her community members the huge health problems that were happening in her community because of the distance between her village and the nearest health post. So as a journalist, at first, I had planned to tell Pratima's story. I was going to write her story. But then it hit me. I realized that she is more than a story. She was the potential for a revolution. What if, I allowed myself to wonder, what if someone like Pratima became the most trusted news source from her community and for the world? What if the world's understanding of places like Nepal came from people like Pratima as opposed to people like me? The more I thought about it, I realized that Pratima had all of these things that I needed to be better at my job. And I had these 2 just little things: professional journalism training and a credible global platform. So when my stories were published, because I had a couple of fancy colleges on my resume, and my stories were appearing in publications that you all know and read, you assumed that I was the best storyteller. The whole world assumed that I was the best storyteller. So I set to work trying to figure out a model and a way where I could give these 2 things to Pratima, and in return, she would give the entire world a whole new way to understand her community through journalism. So, what we've been able to demonstrate is that when someone like Pratima becomes a trained journalist publishing news on a credible global platform, the world changes in 3 very specific ways. First, we're able to increase access to information locally. Now, throughout the world, local news media are often government-owned, highly corrupt, or non-existent in the most rural places. So by training local women in a principled, practiced curriculum that emphasizes investigation and ethics and balance and rigorous storytelling, we are able to disseminate some of the most informationally important and accessible stories that in any of the countries where we operate. Most GPI journalists also do not speak English. So we're able to disseminate their journalism locally in local language because we believe that the more access to information that people have, the better choices they can make. And the more choices we have, the freer and fuller our lives can be. And we believe that journalism is an instigator to people around the world living freer, fuller lives. So that's the first thing that our model does, is it increases access to information locally. The second thing that it does is it elevates awareness globally, right? As I was saying, we understand, our understanding of the developing world is so limited. We understand it in such a limiting context. So when someone like Pratima or like Tara, who you met in the video there, when they become the preeminent source for storytelling in their community, our understanding of the world changes dramatically. I'll give you an example. In Zimbabwe last year, one of our best reporters wrote an incredibly powerful story about political rape and how the dictator in Zimbabwe was systematically having his troops rape women who are campaigning for his opposition. This is a kind of story that we would expect from a place like Zimbabwe, right? Terrible dictator, human rights violations, corrupt politics, generally what the world knows about Zimbabwe. Now, interestingly, Gertrude, the reporter who wrote that story, went on to win a series of very prestigious awards for her coverage. Even more interesting, though, is at the end of the year when we looked at all of the analytics online for the stories that sold most in syndication or were most read, it was not the Zimbabwe story of political rape. It was a different story about Fashion Week in Zimbabwe. Because what many people don't know is that Zimbabwe has a very prolific, productive, and progressive arts community. And last year, at the same time we were reporting about political rape, our arts and culture reporter was also reporting about Fashion Week and these amazing fashion designers from Zimbabwe who were doing all kinds of very innovative things using organic materials and creating just these amazing fashions. That was the story that most syndication outlets purchased and used. That was a story that literally millions of people read online last year. Almost 5 times as many people read the Zimbabwe Fashion Week article than read the political rape article. Just another example of how when people who are locally embedded, there are people who understand the full context of a society, are empowered to tell stories. They can tell the important, hard-hitting political stories, but they can also seek to elevate our awareness of the wholeness of a community. And the last thing that this model does is it employs and empowers women throughout the world. Now, I will tell you, my original business model for GPI was not gender specific. But very shortly into the planning process, I realized that I did not want to do what so many international organizations do, which is that they just provide training in a vacuum, right? Often when I go in country to hire local editors or translators, I see people who have resumes this long, but they're unemployed. They've taken every training that every international organization has ever brought to their community, but they can't find work. They have no practical application for these skills. So what I wanted to do was create a model that was a training to employment model. And the best way to have that make the highest impact was to work with women. Around the world, especially throughout the developing world, it is culturally appropriate, acceptable, and absolutely okay that, generally speaking, men will take these training opportunities and they will take the skills to a different community where they can earn the highest dollar. That's why, for example, as many as 60% of Nepali men live and work outside of Nepal. But what I wanted to do was have a sustained, powerful local impact, not just on the community, but on these women. So that is really the heart of the GPI model, is this training to employment program. As it said in the video, it's a 6-month-long training program, and these women are getting paid for every hour, every day that they spend in training. And at the end of that 6 months, they receive an offer of employment from GPI, either full or part-time employment, whatever works best for them. So I think it's an important conclusion to my story to say that I left Nepal in 2004, stopped my work as a foreign correspondent, moved back to the United States, took a job here in San Francisco as a feature writer, but I just couldn't get the idea out of my head that there was a better way that international news could be reported around the world that could have this personal, local, and global impact. So after a little over a year, I quit my job and set to work developing this new model. By September of 2006, Global Press Institute was a fully formed nonprofit organization, and we were ready to launch our first program in Chiapas, Mexico. Originally, I had wanted our first desk to be in Nepal, but it just made a lot more sense and was frankly faster and easier to test the model for the first time in Mexico, and things went amazingly well. By March of 2007, we were ready to open our second news desk in Nepal. When I traveled back to Nepal to launch the program there, I also traveled back to Pratima's village, where I had first met her years before. I was so excited to see her, to tell her what she had inspired, and frankly, I wanted her to join the training program. I wanted her to live this experience that she had inspired in me. When I returned to her village, I learned that just shortly before, Pratima had passed away from a condition called uterine prolapse, which is a very preventable condition. In fact, she had died on the long walk from her village to the health post, a problem that she had explained to me years before. And I couldn't help but think, if this concept of local journalism had happened earlier, we could have gotten the attention of local government, international organizations, healthcare workers. We could have done something. So I left Pratima's village, obviously with a very heavy heart, because I was too late for Pratima. But at least at this point, our time had come. And in the years since, Global Press Institute has expanded throughout the world. So I want to tell you just a little bit about how it works. These are kind of some of the most common questions that I get. So the first thing that we do when we go into a new country is we do a safety and security analysis with our country selection. People ask all of the time, why isn't there a GPI in Iraq? Why isn't there a GPI in China? And the journalist in me certainly wishes that there was, but when you're working with women throughout the developing world, their safety and security is of the utmost importance to us. So I've designed a methodology for evaluating the safety and security of a country, constitutionally, but also in terms of looking specifically through a gender lens, risks that exist specifically for women working as journalists. Once we do that and a country passes with a score of at least 5 or higher in our own evaluation system, we began recruiting women working through partnership networks. For example, the Ethiopia example I gave you earlier, we partnered with everyone from the United Nations, local colleges and universities, all the way down to an organization called Goal Ethiopia, which works specifically with girls who are homeless and are very often victims of child marriage. So by partnering with organizations across the full scope of society, we can recruit from those very same organizations. Today, Global Press Institute reporters, there's 133 of them around the world. Some of them have master's degrees and bachelor's degrees, and they just happen to live in countries where there's 50 to 60% unemployment for women, so this becomes a great job opportunity for them. There are also women in the GPI family who have no formal education whatsoever. They're former sex workers or members of the untouchable caste. So the training program is tailored to women from all different walks of life. So after we've made these partnerships, we recruit a team of local reporters and editors, generally 3 to 5 reporters at a time, and they go to work in this training to employment program. At the conclusion of the training program, they get offered a job of full or part-time employment, and then they go to work within GPI's very sophisticated editorial structure. Most people are most familiar with our news because it's printed online, but the fact is that GPI is very much a bricks and mortar organization. In every country where we operate, we have a news desk, a physical office where these women can come and learn and train and report. These offices are staffed by local editors and translators and journalists. They are run just like a real professional newsroom. Around the world, each of our journalists has story coaches and mentors. And when the news is produced, it's disseminated locally in country, in local language, and then it's translated into English. It also goes through a full legal libel fact check, a legal libel fact check that rivals what they use certainly at the Press Democrat and even at the New York Times. So the end product is a highly ethical, credible piece of journalism. So this is how it looks when it lands on our GPI Newswire. And so what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the impact from some of our stories. Because while we've talked about there's a local impact when you increase access to information, and there's a global impact when people like us around the world have better access and knowledge to these stories, certainly there's an empowerment impact for the women of GPI. But there's a really amazing, amazing thing that happens when people around the world receive access to ethical, credible, powerful storytelling. They take action. One of the most unique things about Global Press Institute is that we actually track the impact of our journalism. So I want to give you a couple of examples now about some of our stories that have made absolutely extraordinary local and global impact. This story was written by a young reporter in Rwanda just 3 months after she completed the training program. This is a story about sex corruption in Rwanda. A small organization in Rwanda conducted a study over the course of a few years that revealed that as many as 86% of women in Rwanda admitted to having to have sex with their bosses in order to either get employment or keep their employment. Now, this study was published in Kinyarwanda by a small organization. So any foreign correspondent that would have come into Rwanda would not have been able to access this story unless they magically spoke Kinyarwanda. Because we're working with these local people, she found out about this story. And she told a powerful, powerful story with a lot of examples of very brave people who are willing to go on the record and talk about their experience with sex corruption. Just days after the story was published, we got a call in the news desk from some members of parliament. You may or may not know that Rwanda is a very unique country in Africa for many reasons, but also because there are the most women parliamentarians than any other country on the continent. So a member of parliament calls up and says, I want to talk to Rita Boomley. Now, I'll tell you, it's not always a good thing when members of parliament call up a news desk. But on this particular occasion, it was. And they invited Rita to come and address a gathering of parliament to talk about her findings. And she did. She practiced very hard her speech and went over all of her notes and made sure that she was very confident in what she was going to say. And as a result of her story and her appearance in front of parliament, they've just written a new law in Rwanda that criminalizes sex corruption in a new and profound way. So certainly change won't happen overnight, but this quality journalism forced local government to act. So that is an impact that we track. At GPI, we have 2 law changes to our credit over the last 7 years, one in Rwanda very recently, and the other was in 2010 in Nepal. Tara, who you all met in the video, who I like to call the world's greatest human, which she is, she wrote a story about violence being faced by people of intercaste couples in Nepal. In Nepal, Arranged marriage is hugely common, and even if you do get to choose a love marriage, as they call it, generally speaking, 99% of the time, you would choose a love marriage with someone in your caste. For people who chose love marriages that were outside of their caste, either a high caste man marrying a low caste woman or vice versa, the local persecution was violent, constant, and intense. So Tara wrote this very brave piece about intercaste newlyweds who were being evicted from their communities, whose homes were being burned down, who were being beaten in local markets, just a couple of months after this story was published. Tara was contacted again by the government. The Prime Minister's office this time got a hold of her story, had her come in, talk about the problem, talk about what was going on, and within a year, Parliament had passed a new law that made intercaste discrimination a constitutional offense. So as Nepal continues to be in this constitution building phase of its existence, laws like this are more important than ever because it's helping to build a foundation for a new and freer Nepal. But it's not always government action that we're looking for. Sometimes individual action is just as powerful. And individual action can literally be, we've had reporters who have stopped our journalists in supermarkets or walking down the street and said things like, hey, your story about this or that changed my life. It gave me the courage to do something that I've never had the courage to do before. The most common comment that we receive on our website is, oh my God, now I know that this is a problem and an issue. What can I do? When people receive access to this kind of high quality, ethical, high impact information, they have no choice but to take action. In this particular story this summer, it was global organizations using our journalism as a catalyst to take action. Aliyah Bashir is a pretty new reporter at Global Press Institute, and she lives in Kashmir. She received word that a lot of infants were strangely dying at the Kashmir state-run children's hospital. So she decided to go and check it out. She spent 6 weeks reporting this extremely difficult story. After 6 weeks of reporting, she found that on average, 13 infants a week were dying in this hospital. In 98% of the cases, the cause of death was asphyxiation. The infant ventilators and incubators weren't working. They were literally placing sick infants in ventilators and incubators that were broken, effectively causing the infant to suffocate. While its parents were often standing right by, nurses and doctors were standing right by. One of the things we'll talk about next is Global Press Institute's business model and revenue generating model, but we do syndicate our stories. So the day after this story appeared on the GPI Newswire, it was picked up by 2 of our largest partners, UPI, United Press International, and Reuters. 2 major international organizations saw this story on our partner via syndication, and within 2 days, 2 major organizations had pledged the donation of new infant incubators and ventilators. I don't think that there is a more powerful example of the direct correlation between story and action. No one locally was telling this story, and infants were dying. 500 infants died in this hospital between January and June. Days after this story was published, infants were no longer dying in this hospital. We know that the equipment has been received in this hospital, and we're also trying to work with local partners to make sure that doctors and nurses actually know how to work this new equipment. That's a really big problem around the world as well. So that's what we do at Global Press Institute. We educate, employ, and empower women to become professional journalists. And as a result of their journalism, people all over the world are newly empowered themselves to take action and create change. One final thing that I'll talk about today before we open up for questions is our business model. At GPI, we strive for innovation in literally everything that we do. And one thing that is always so difficult for organizations like Global Press Institute is fundraising. Now, I admit to you, when I founded GPI at the age of 25, I had never heard of social enterprise. I had no idea what it was, and I had no idea that one day I would be receiving awards as an innovative social entrepreneur, because I didn't even know what that was when I began. But at GPI, our model of social enterprise is really the key, what is going to be the key to our long-term success. Now, I don't think I will shock anyone in this room when I tell you that the business of journalism is struggling, is in chaos and decline. It turns out that not only is foreign correspondence an impractical model of storytelling, as I found when I first went to Nepal, it's also an impractical business model. On average, a piece of foreign correspondence that appears in, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times costs a minimum of usually about $10,000 for one print news story. All right, and we're not even talking about, Anderson Cooper heading out to Egypt and doing those broadcasts, which is just a ridiculously huge expense. So while traditional foreign correspondence costs $10,000 per article, the average GPI news story costs $75 to produce and publish. So foreign bureaus are too expensive. In the last 10 years, we've seen the total opposite of traditional journalism come about in response, and that's citizen journalism, citizen media, right? Twitter, Facebook, blogging. It's not credible. There is no system of fact check. We don't know who these people are. Twitter is 140 characters, and how on earth are we supposed to receive our news and actually become a more educated citizenry like that? So foreign correspondence is too expensive. Citizen journalism is not credible. And so we believe that GPI is an emerging new third way. It's the best of both worlds. We have the feet on the street like citizen journalism, but we also have the structured editorial system that creates really amazing journalism. But as a consequence of our model, we are creating a saleable commodity. Over the last 20 years, 80% of foreign news bureaus have closed because, frankly, the news organizations can no longer sustain them. So we recognize that as an opportunity at GPI because newspapers all over the world need and want content like we have to offer. And we can offer it at literally next to no charge. For $50, $65 a month, news organizations can receive a syndication feed where they can take every single article that we produce. A comparable service would be a subscription to the AP, the Associated Press News Service, which is a small to mid-sized newspaper like the Press Democrat probably spends about $400,000 a year on the Associated Press feed. So it's a natural business model, it's a natural fit, but it also fits our mission because we can increase our impact tenfold through syndication, right? As we learned with Aaliyah's story, those major organizations that donated the ventilators, they didn't see the story on the GPI Newswire. They saw the story through Reuters and UPI. So we can heighten our impact through three really specific metrics. The first metric I call the eyeball metric. The GPI Newswire receives just about 30,000 unique reads a month. Through syndication, we receive about 5 million unique reads a month. So it goes without saying that the more people have access to this news, the greater our chances that it's going to create impact. And whether that impact is you changing your mind about how you feel about Zimbabwe or a law changing in that country, it's going to elevate our ability to make an impact. The second impact is revenue. Right now, Global Press Institute is 10% sustainable based on the sale of our content. And in 5 years, we believe that we will be 100% sustainable, which means that organizational resources that are currently devoted to fundraising will be designated solely to our production and our journalism around the world. So we'll only fundraise when we need to expand or grow, but every dollar that we make from syndication is directly reinvested into our news desks, making the organization sustainable. And I take nothing more seriously on this earth than my commitment to employ the journalists of GPI. And so I'm really excited about the revenue impact model because it means our ability to continue to employ these women is assured in the future. And finally, local distribution. Because we are generating revenue by selling our content globally, it allows us more resources to ensure that the content receives a wider audience locally. So that means that the people around the world who need this information the most will get it increasingly as we begin to syndicate more and more in local language. So that's a little bit about me, about the storytelling of Global Press Institute, and about the business model that is going to drive and sustain us in years going forward. So I would love to take any questions that you might have, and thank you so much for your kind attention.